Hello and welcome to the second lesson for Microsoft Project Training. My name is Frank Perini and today we'll be going through work breakdown structure. So if you haven't already, please watch the previous lesson video which gives an introduction to this course as well as talks about what version of Microsoft Project and things like that you'll need. So go ahead and open up Microsoft Project and we're going to create a new file today from blank project. Okay. And if you remember from yesterday's video, one of the first things that we want to do when we create a new project is we want to set the start date of the project if it's known. If it's not known, it still might be a good idea for you to go ahead and put in the tentative start date or a good estimated start date so that you can start to take advantage of automatic scheduling. What you'll see is without that information, Microsoft Project has a more difficult time doing the auto scheduling. So it's really important that you put this information in at the beginning of a project. If you wait till you've already entered lots of data, lots of information, and start to do this at the end, you'll find that things might have to start moving around and it might cause more confusion. So best practice is to try to start this thing off on the right foot by setting up the project start date. So if you remember from the first video, we're going to go ahead and click on the project tab, project information window, and we're going to choose a start date. So for today's lesson, let's choose January 1st of 2021, which would be a future date for me. Maybe if you're from the future watching this video, this is the past for you. So go ahead and choose January 1st, 2021, or you could choose a different date. Just keep a mental note of what that date is. So we have a blank project, and on the left we have, again, what looks kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, and on the right we have this empty chart. Now we're going to start to create a work breakdown structure for our project, and as we do that, we're going to enter tasks into Microsoft Project. You can think of a task in Microsoft Project as a WBS item. It could either be a summary of some more work breakdown structure, work packages, or it could actually be the tasks themselves. So we're going to enter a WBS for a very high level project, and for today's project we're going to assume that we're working for a company that gets a specification from a customer to make a widget or make a product, and they have to design that product based on the customer's specifications. They have to design that product, build and validate that product, and then of course launch that product to the market or provide that to the customer. So that's kind of a generic, either manufacturing or it could even be like a software product. It doesn't really matter, but it's kind of a generic workflow where we start a project, we work with a customer. Our customer could be internal. It could be a product manager in our organization giving us a specification. But we have a customer that gives the product manager the requirements. That handoff takes place. Then the product manager starts to drive the functional managers to do the project or program. So let's look at that. So every project starts with a project charter, and this is really important because this is not just something that's taught in the PMP and things like that, but without a proper start date, it's really difficult to track if a project's on track, whether a project is truly authorized to go, whether you have resources. So it's really important as a project manager that you enforce that and you really focus on getting a well-documented charter that gives you the authorization to execute the project. So we're going to go ahead and create a task called charter approval. I personally, when I create my projects, I don't track all of the tasks that go into making a charter because to me a project starts at charter approval. Now you could go in here and say, charter start, maybe charter development. You could put more detail into the charter if you'd like to, but I personally prefer to keep the program separated from the charter, and I have the first task in my charter in my product. The first task in my project is always the charter approval. That's when the project is officially authorized to go. So we have a charter approval. Next, we would have, let's call customer specifications. Okay. we're thinking about this from the very high level 10,000 foot view. What would this project look like? So first we have our charter. Next we have our customer specifications. Next we would have design, maybe design engineering. Okay. After design work, we might have validation, or maybe we'll call this design validation. We want to validate our design, that it meets the customer's specifications and it works and it meets all the requirements for the project. And then we might have a launch. Okay, so at a very high level, this is kind of like a gate process for a project. We have a charter, customer specifications, design engineering, design validation, and launch. Okay, so one of the things about Microsoft Project that's kind of nice is it's actually a good tool to use to actually develop your WBS. So you don't have to do it in a spreadsheet and then copy and paste it into Project. I like to develop my WBS either from a template that I already have stored in Project, or I just do it like I'm doing right now. So, of course, this isn't enough detail. We can't just summarize a whole project by saying, here's the charter, here's the customer specifications, design, engineering, validation, launch. It'd be like building a house and saying, okay, my project is step 1, buy the land, step 2, build the house. That's definitely not enough detail to properly execute a project like that. You need a lot more detail. Step 1 might be, survey the land. Step 2 might be get the contract for the land. Step 3 might be find a builder. Step 4 might be select a layout. So there's lots and lots of steps that go into each of those other tasks, those higher level tasks. So right now we're at the absolute highest level that you can be at a project. So we need to develop more detail for our WBS. So customer specifications includes some subtasks, if you will, that I want to document in my project. So that's kind of the high level task. So let's insert some tasks between customer specifications and design engineering. So one way to do that is you can, on the task menu, you can click on task, and this will insert a task, a new task. You can see it did that. Or a hotkey on the keyboard that I use a lot is just the insert button. Pressing the insert button will insert a row, and it's really handy. It's a great shortcut when you have to insert lots of tasks. You don't have to find the menu and waste a lot of time. So that's a very good hotkey shortcut to learn, is pressing the insert button on your keyboard. So we're going to insert a task. So underneath customer specifications, let's have kickoff meeting. So maybe the first thing we do is we have a kickoff meeting with our customer. Okay. Let's insert another row. I'm going to use the insert button on my keyboard this time. After the kickoff meeting, we might have develop quotation. So at the kickoff meeting, we met with the customer, we asked them a lot of questions. They provided us with a detailed, maybe RFP type document. Now we have to take that and go back and develop a quotation in this theoretical case. Okay. And then the last step for customer specifications might be quotation. Let's call it quotation submittal. So this is where we took all the customer specs, we had a kickoff meeting, we developed a quotation, maybe a detailed technical package, and then we submitted that formally to the customer. And then maybe one last step might be customer quote review, or let's call it customer quotation approval. And what I mean by that is the customer has reviewed our quotation and made sure that we quoted the right thing. We quoted what they wanted. If there was any ambiguity or any concerns, that we addressed that and maybe provided an updated quotation until the customer felt like we submitted the right bid package so that they could make a decision. Okay? So before we keep going, you're probably noticing a couple things. First of all, you're noticing that this doesn't look very organized. It's kind of just a list of tasks. It's not very organized. So the first thing we want to learn is the difference between a task, which all of these are tasks, and what's called a summary task, which is right here. So this is the button for a summary task, and you can see it looks like a little black bar bracket. So what we want to do is we want all of these tasks that we just created that are really part of customer specifications, we want those to become a subtask of customer specifications. So how do we do that? Well, what we have to do in Microsoft Project is indent them. So you can see there's a button here for indent, and there's also a hotkey, another hotkey that's a shortcut that's very convenient that I use all the time is Alt-Shift-Right. So if you hold Alt-Shift and press right, it will indent those tasks. Now, let's look at what just happened because there's a few interesting things that just happened. First, the most obvious is, of course, these tasks are indented. They moved a little bit from a formatting perspective. But a lot more important things have happened other than just indenting those tasks. If you look, row number 2, which is customer specifications, some things have changed to that row. First, the task mode icon has changed, and we haven't talked about task modes, and we will shortly, but the task mode icon has changed. The customer specifications task is now bolded. It has this little arrow which allows collapsing and uncollapsing of the task below it, okay? And it has data that I didn't enter. It has a duration of 0 days, and it has a start and finish date that I did not enter. So what's happened here is Microsoft Project turned these tasks into subtasks of this summary task called customer specifications. And as a rule, almost always, a summary task should be automatically calculated. So what Microsoft Project has done is it has changed the task mode from manually scheduled with a question mark to auto scheduled, and we'll get into that shortly. Okay? So now let's look at what the value is of the project start date and what auto scheduling and manually scheduling mean. So let's look at that next before we continue to develop this work breakdown structure. So I have a charter approval, and let's say the charter approval was January 1st of 2021. Okay, I'm going to move this out just a little bit so we can see all those columns. So one thing that I could do is if I know my charter was January 1st of 2021, I could just say, okay, the start date and finish date for the charter was January 1st of 2021. And you'll notice that where there was a question mark with a icon that looks like a pin, that represents a manually scheduled task. Now I have the pin, which represents a manually scheduled task, but the question mark's gone. Okay? So what that means is project is telling me that, yeah, this task was manually scheduled. Manually because, Frank, you chose the start and finish dates for this task. You manually scheduled it. It's not a question anymore of whether this should or should not be manually scheduled. Because you manually scheduled it, I'm going to assume that that's what it's supposed to be, and I'm going to take away the question mark. So Microsoft Project has interpreted my data entry here as saying, yes, I definitely want this task manually scheduled. Versus these other ones, which are manually scheduled, but there's a question mark because Project's saying, hey, you created these, but you didn't go in and fill anything out, so double check, make sure you want this to be manually scheduled, or do you want it to be auto scheduled? It's saying that you need to go in here and check all these tasks. They're not really finished yet. Another interesting thing that happened was the duration was automatically filled in. I did not put in 1 day. I'll undo that so you can see that again. Okay, I'll put in a start date of January 1st. I'll put in a finish date of January 1st, 2021. And you'll notice that one day is automatically calculated, okay? Another thing that's automatically happened is this bar has now shown up on the Gantt chart as a kind of light blue or greenish blue looking bar, which represents a manually scheduled task. Okay, so now I could go through and say, well, I'm going to have my kickoff meeting on what date. I'm going to have my quotation on what date. I could go through and start to populate all that, but you kind of see where we're going. You see the problem with that. The problem is it kind of takes away all the value of Microsoft Project. What's the point of having this tool if I just have to enter data like an Excel spreadsheet and start filling in all the dates? The only advantage I guess it gives me is it gives me this Gantt chart, I guess, but it still doesn't provide a lot of extra value. So this is where auto scheduling comes in. Now, I'm going to undo that so it's blank. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change, instead of filling in the duration and the start and the finish dates, I'm going to change the task mode of charter approval, which is the first task, okay, in my list. And the task has no predecessors, which we'll talk about in a moment. I'm going to change the task mode from manual ? To auto, which means I want Microsoft Project to automatically schedule this for me. Let's see what happens. Okay, what you see is Microsoft Project has automatically scheduled this for January 1st, 2021, the same date that I happened to pick earlier, but it's for a totally different reason. Microsoft Project by default will schedule an auto-schedule task to start as early as possible. And because this task had no constraints, Microsoft Project knows the start date of my project is January 1st, 2021, which is why it's so important at the beginning of a project that we have the correct date here. If, for example, I had the wrong date, let's say I had October 1st, 2020, you'll see that automatically this task date has now changed because it wants to start that activity as soon as possible in the project plan, even if that's in the past, because by default it wants to start every activity as soon as possible unless there's a constraint governing it. So that's why it's really important to have the correct start date. Okay, I'm going to reset the start date to the correct January 1st, 2021, which is what we're using here. Now, I'll talk about that in a moment. So you can see that by changing this from manual to auto, automatically project was able to set a start and a finish date. Now, you're going to notice that the duration is 1 day ? And the reason for that is I didn't give Microsoft Project enough information to know the finish date. Let's undo everything and let's think about that. Right now, Microsoft Project has no information about the charter. It doesn't know how long it takes. It doesn't know when it should start. It doesn't know when it should finish, and it has no constraints. So when I tell Microsoft Project automatically schedule that task for me, what it does is by default it says we're going to start that task as soon as possible, January 1st, 2021. But I still don't know when it's going to finish. I'm going to assume it takes 1 day by default, but I'm going to tell you it's an estimate, 1 day ? I'm waiting for you, the program manager, to go in there and set a date. Does that make sense? So let's undo that. And let's see what happens if I had set a duration. Let's say the charter approval takes 1 day. Let's say it takes 2 days. 2D, D is short for day. Okay, so Microsoft Project knows that this activity, this task takes 2 days now. But it doesn't know when it's going to start or finish. All it knows is it's 2 days, and you can see it's got this kind of gradient looking bar. It's like, okay, I don't know when it starts, when it finishes, but it's about 2 days of duration. So let's see what happens when I set this to auto scheduled. Okay, a couple of interesting things have happened. First, I don't have a question mark, right? My duration is still 2 days. I have a finish date of 1/4, and the bar has changed from that gradient light green to kind of a solid blue color, which indicates an auto schedule task on my Gantt timeline. So you might be asking yourself, why would a task that has a duration of 2 days start on January 1st and finish on January 4th? That's 3 days or 4 days of work. Well, the reason is, if you notice carefully, that's a Friday, and Saturday and Sunday are not work days in the default calendar. We are going to talk about calendars later, but by default, Project knows that if you start this on a Friday and it takes 2 days, you can't really expect to finish that until after Monday. So be careful. Duration doesn't always necessarily directly correlate to the start and finish, depending on how our calendars are set up. So we'll talk more about calendars and setting up calendars for resources and things like that. But just be aware, okay? So now that we know how to manually and auto schedule tasks, and we kind of understand the relationships, let's undo everything and let's go back to kind of our blank start. Let's create what's called a milestone, because the charter approval is not a work package in my project plan. It's a milestone, my project start date. So the milestone is represented by this diamond, this kind of gray diamond here, and you can actually see insert a milestone, and I'll insert a milestone, and you'll see when I click insert milestone, it creates a task. But the difference between that and insert task is it puts a duration of 0 days. In Microsoft Project, a milestone is just like a normal task, with the main difference that the duration is set to 0 days. Okay, so let's undo that. So I can change this so let's actually set this to auto scheduled. So we have it start on January 1st, which makes sense. Our project start date is January 1st, but I have a bar here, and I really want a milestone. I want to say that that's the start of the project. So if I go in here and I hit 0 days and hit enter, you can see it has changed. This task is now a milestone represented by a diamond with the date of January 1st. And you can see the finish date has updated. Now, I haven't talked about this yet, but you've probably noticed this as we've been entering data. A few general comments. First, sometimes the order of what we do matters. So for example, when I entered the duration first and then set auto, Project made different assumptions about that task than when I just had a blank there and I hit auto. So keep that in mind. It doesn't mean it can't be fixed, and it doesn't mean you have to follow a specific order, but be aware that Project makes assumptions about the data based on what information it has. And one of the ways Project tells us about the assumptions that it makes is by highlighting the cells that have changed every time we do something. So let me undo that, and you'll see I have this row here that's all white cells. But when I change this to 0 days and hit enter, you'll notice that the cell is kind of this grayish blue fill, both on the durations, which I just changed, but also on the finish. And that's letting you take notice that, hey, Frank, the change you just made is going to affect this other data. Or the change you just made is going to cause me to make this assumption. And I want you to be aware that I made this assumption, and I'm going to move these dates around because I think that's what you want. But if that's not what you want, make sure you pay attention to it and correct it. sometimes project doesn't do exactly what we think or what we want it to do. So always be very careful and slow down a little bit as you're entering your data, and make sure that what changes you're expecting are it's the correct output. Because project will make assumptions about other data as we enter our data, okay? So please keep that in mind, and you can see those cells are still highlighted. They will remain highlighted until I make another change. So for example, if I entered another task down here, you can see this changed to gray because it's created this new task, but this is no longer gray. So by slowing down and paying attention, you can be careful. When I hit undo, these are gray again. So it's telling me your previous change affected these cells. So slow down and pay attention to what project is doing. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and start entering some data for our work breakdown structure. So we have design engineering. So customer specifications looks good, and we can open and close that. So let's look at design engineering. So let's hit insert, and let's insert a couple more tasks. So we might have 3D model. Let's just assume we're going to make a widget. So we might have 3D modeling. We might have 2D drawings. And we might have specifications. So we have to create 3D models. We have to create 2D drawings from those 3D models. And then after we have our 3D modeling and our 2D drawings complete, we're going to create the final specification package. Or let's call this manufacturing specification. So maybe after we've finished modeling it, drawing it, now we can create the manufacturing package. Okay, so again, let's highlight these rows and let's indent them so they're underneath design engineering. Okay, so now we have 3 subtasks that are part of this task called design engineering. Okay, next we have design validation. So let's insert a row and let's call this maybe build prototype. And then let's insert one more. Let's call this test prototype. And let's indent those tasks. So now we have a design validation gate with a couple of tasks in our work breakdown structure. And then finally we have launch. And we'll just leave launch maybe as a task for this really simple work breakdown structure. Again, you're going to want to go into more detail likely for this type of a project, but I just want to illustrate the functions of project at a high level here. So next, let's talk about let's auto schedule all these tasks. So as a best practice, what I want to say is that as a best practice, you should have as few as possible of manually scheduled tasks. And there's a few reasons for that. First, a manually scheduled task requires being manually maintained, which again is the opposite of what we want in Microsoft Project. We really want this nice tool to do the hard work for us and just give us good information and help us manage our projects. So the more tasks that are auto scheduled, the easier that is. But secondly, the engine that is driving Microsoft Project will only look at tasks that are auto-scheduled. So the more things in our critical path, the more things in our project plan that are on the auto-scheduling system, we can manipulate those better, and we can add and remove resources. We can look at impact analysis based on resources and things like that. But if the more things that are manually scheduled, the less effective those things become, because the project scheduling engine isn't going to move around a manually scheduled task. It's going to say, okay, Frank said it must be on this date. That's the date it's going to be. I'm just going to totally ignore that. And maybe that's the critical piece in our project that needs to be moved around or needs to be adjusted, and it will be harder to find because it's been manually scheduled. So as a best practice, you should really try to auto schedule almost everything if you can, or have it manually scheduled maybe at the very beginning of a project, but as the project continues to move along, as you get more clarity, you're going to want to start to to have more and more of those tasks become auto-scheduled. So we're going to go ahead and drag this down. We're going to drag auto-schedule down from the top here so that everything is auto-scheduled. And let's see what happens. Okay, so when we changed all of these tasks to auto-scheduled, you're going to notice that it immediately assigned all of these tasks to start on January 1st, 2021, kind of like before with the charter, and finish on January 1st, 2021, with a 1-day question mark duration, estimated duration. So let's undo that. Okay, and let's put in our durations first, and let's see how that affects that. So a kickoff meeting might take, let's say, maybe 3 days. Maybe we need 3 days, 1 day to meet with the customer or prepare, and then a couple days to maybe collect all of the information, create meeting minutes of meeting, any follow-up activities. So let's say we need 3 days of work to do a full kickoff meeting. And then maybe we need 2 weeks to develop a quotation for the customer. So we're going to put in 2 weeks. And weeks can be 2W or 2WKS. Okay. We're going to put in quotation submittal. So after 2 weeks, maybe we submit the quotation to the customer. And we expect them to review that for about a week. So let's say 1 week. And then customer quotation approval. So customer quotation approval in this case, it could be a task, it could be work, but because we have tasks for doing the quotation and submitting it, this is probably a milestone. Once the customer reviews and approves your quotation, that's probably more of a milestone activity that you're going to want to document later in reporting. So that's why we're going to call that a milestone. Okay. And let's do the same here. So let's say 3D modeling, maybe we need 1 month. So month is MO, 1 MO, 1 month. Maybe 2D drawings need, let's say 2 weeks to accomplish. Okay. And then manufacturing specifications, let's say that takes 3 weeks to develop. Okay. Building a prototype. Let's say that takes about 1 month to build a prototype, and testing, let's say that takes 2 months. Okay? And then the launch of this, again, that's probably a milestone. Launching this product to the market or to your customer, that's a milestone. So we've entered the duration for all of these, but again, we're not going to want to go in here and manually set the start dates. Like, okay, I scheduled this meeting with the customer on the 6th of January. We're not going to want to do that. We're going to want to have Microsoft Project automatically schedule these activities for us. So I'm going to hit, again, we're going to go over here and we're going to pull down auto schedule. So you can see all of our schedules are automatic, all of our tasks are automatically scheduled, but they're all starting at the same time. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? First, we got to have the kickoff meeting before we do the quotation. So we have to talk about predecessors and constraints. One of the most important constraints on a project is a predecessor. There are others for a task, but predecessor is the biggest one. And we're going to talk about that for a few minutes, and then we're going to finish up this video since we've learned quite a bit. So you can see that there's a column here called predecessor, and if I double click a task, I'll open up this task information dialog. It can also be opened over here in the task ribbon under information. There's a tab called predecessors, okay? And we're going to go into the different types of predecessors in more detail. But for today, we're just going to look at the easiest one to understand, which is called finish to start. And what finish to start means is a task, you finish one task and then you can start another task. There are others like start to start, where we start one task and then we can start another task. But today, let's just focus on finish to start, which is the default in project. So after the charter approval, we can have our kickoff meeting, right? It wouldn't make sense to kick off and have a quotation to the customer before we had our charter signed off. So what we want to do is we want to say the kickoff meeting's predecessor is charter approval. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the task ID, which is number 1. That's this row number here. Okay, and I'm going to type it in this predecessor column. And watch what happens to the Gantt chart over here when I hit enter. It created this little arrow here which represents the constraint and the relationship, the linkage between the two. Okay, and I'm going to undo that just to show you the other way that you could do this. If you were in this task window, again by double clicking on this, you could have also either entered the task ID or found it here. So I could have found charter approval, and by default it has a finish to start constraint. And that would do the same thing. So you can see it didn't move because the charter approval is just a milestone and it has no duration. It's just a milestone. It's like a signpost in the road, but it does create that linkage. And you can prove that it has the linkage because if I manually override and move that date, let me do it on a work day, to like the Monday, because the charter was late, somebody that was supposed to sign off the charter was late, now I can document that in my project by saying that this finished late, right? This finished on this date. It gives me a little warning that that's an extra constraint that I've added that wasn't part of the auto scheduling. But you can see when I did that, it moved that task. That linkage is still there and it moved that task over here. And it informed me over here, hey, FYI, what you just did, what you just changed also impacted this data down here. So I'm going to undo that. But that just shows you that the linkage is there. And we're going to go ahead and create the linkages now for all of these really quickly. And watch the Gantt chart over here as I create these finish to start relationships. So I'm going to enter a 3 now, not a 2, because 2 is this summary task, but I want develop quotation to follow the kickoff meeting, which is number 3. So I'm going to enter 3. And you see how that slid over here? Keep watching over on the Gantt chart. 4. Okay, and I'll zoom out the Gantt chart a little bit so you can continue to watch that. Okay, so now I'm going to enter 5 and see how that milestone, customer quotation milestone, is now linked to this previous task, to the predecessor, okay, quotation submittal. Okay, and we're not going to start our 3D modeling until the customer has approved our quotation. That makes sense, right? So I'm going to set the predecessor for this as number 6. Again, I'm going to skip 7 because that's a summary task. Okay. Next, I'm going to set the linkage for this one. So I'm going to say 8, 9. And I'm going to fill in the rest here. So 10, 11. Oops. See, I made a mistake there. This should be, that was a summary test. So 10. Now I got to do 12 and 13. Okay. So let's look at the Gantt chart a little more clearly here. So you can see that once I did that, it created this finish to start relationship for my whole project. And all of these arrows represent finish to start links, finish to start relationships. And the next task in the work breakdown structure that's assigned to that link cannot start until the previous one has finished. And by doing so, project has automatically driven a calculated schedule because I had already given durations for those activities. I said building a prototype takes 1 month. And by doing that, it knows when the prototype building can start based on the constraints, and it knows it takes 1 month, and it can automatically calculate now how long it'll take to finish that. And based on that finish date, the next task's start date changes accordingly. So that's the power of the scheduling engine. Now, if any of these were set to manual and we had done that, this wouldn't have worked. Okay, so that's the advantage of using auto scheduling. And we're going to go into more detail on tasks and good practices, best practices, and task management. But this is a very basic look at how to enter tasks, how to start thinking about creating a work breakdown structure, and how to start assigning relationships between your tasks so that Microsoft Project's scheduling engine can do all the hard work for you. So thank you very much for joining me with today's video. I hope you found it very informative. Please like and subscribe to this video series. I'll be continuing to add more videos, and also feel free to leave a note in the comments about any questions or topics specifically related to Microsoft Project or project management in general that you would like covered. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.